If your friends are badgering you to join them on WoW, or you thought you just wanted to give the game a try, we'd like to help you make a more informed decision, as we've spent a lot of time on every class, so let's take a look. In this video there will be no builds or talents, but just the flavour you can expect from playing the classes. Picking your class in any game can be a challenge when you don't know what they're like, made even more difficult for the likes of MMOs, where you might be expected to invest significant amounts of time on your character. Class balance in WoW is always going to be a never-ending juggling exercise. What is strong now may not be so in the next expansion or even the next patch, so I'd advise to choose based on the types of role you feel you'd like, and then the themes and playstyles that catch your eye. And there's always the option for more than one character if you have the time and the patience. You don't need to know anything about the game to follow this guide, so if that's helpful, this video is specifically for you. Let's kick off with the plate-wearing classes, starting with the Warrior, the most down-to-earth designed class. I wouldn't say basic as they're packed with utility, but the least dependent on magic of all the classes, their prowess solely based on their raw strength. Their resource is Rage, unique to themselves in the bare form of the Druid class, this being the resource for their abilities obtained only through combat, a mechanism well suited to the themes of a Berserker type class. As masters of weaponry, warriors are home in the thick of the fight. Their very recognisable charge ability lets them stick on targets with an auto-tracking rush towards their enemies' faces. They have a great level of crowd control options and are proficient at executing enemies at low HP. As for team-wide support, they have a range of shouts that can buff ally HP, weaken nearby enemies, or even fear them away. For roles, warriors have a solid tanking spec based more on blocking, with particular emphasis on defending physical attacks. Otherwise, they have two interesting DPS specs. One two-handed wielding, well-rounded spec with a lot of utility, a spin to win, and a more damage-oriented spec capable of wielding a two-handed weapon in each hand with built-in sustain in the kit. Next up is the Paladin, the Holy Warrior, thematically called to protect the weak and bring justice to the unjust. They are a hybrid class, meaning they have the ability to do both damage and heal effectively, and they use more magic-oriented abilities. Notably, they have a great ability most just call their Bubble, which removes all negative effects from the Paladin and grants immunity to all damage for a small amount of time, only being removable by a few abilities in the game. Pallies also use blessings, being very team-oriented. They can remove slows and snares on allies, as well as grant them temporary immunity to physical attacks. They cast from a pool of mana as their resource, as well as a unique resource called Holy Power, which must be built up using certain abilities before it can be spent on more powerful ones. They have a spec to cover every role in the game. Their tank spec has smaller amounts of physical mitigation than say the Warrior, but also has decent magic damage reduction as well as great tools for self and team healing. They use the good old sword and board for weapon options, where throwing their shield at multiple enemies is a signature ability that offers them a decent ranged attack on enemies. For DPS, you can wield two-handed weapons to hit like a truck, great utility and team support, as well as really decent self and team heals. However, they have a slight lack of mobility, and other than Bubble, lacking a lot of mitigated defenses. Finally, they have a healing spec. Here they bring with them all the supporting characteristics that a Paladin has to offer, as well as good direct heals as opposed to heal over time spells. And this means they play a bit more reactive than preemptively. The Death Knight is the third and last plate-wearing class in WoW, described as a hero class due to it having a number of perks over the base classes in the game, and the ability to start at a much higher level. They draw on dark magic using a rune system as a resource, themed around Unholy, Frost and Blood. Incidentally, these are the names of their three specs. One of their more notable abilities is Death Grip, the ability to pull an enemy towards them from a decent range away, making their foes incredibly hard to escape. And you'll often see Death Knights with some sort of undead pet or an undead army rising to their aid. Their tank spec is great at dealing with mainly magic damage, with fantastic slow abilities and spreads negative disease effects like nobody's business. They're able to self-sustain with heals, but unlike that of the Paladin, these are only self-healing abilities. The first of the Death Knight's two DPS specs is themed around Frost. Dual-wielding one-handed weapons, they deal great burst and AoE damage with some decent baseline utility. What they lack in mobility, they make up for in potential to snare their enemies. Their Unholy Theme spec uses two-handed weapons and focuses more on disease spreading and summoning the undead. They do strong single target damage, which slowly ramps up over time, making them more devastating the longer a fight goes on. Next are the male-wearing classes, where we'll start off with Hunter. Hunters are called to the wild and masters of their environment. With a pet by their side, which you can tame from any of the hundreds of beasts around Azeroth, they're highly mobile and relentless with their damage and crowd control. With great utility like camouflage to hide from unsuspecting eyes and traps to snare or incapacitate enemies, as well as poison stings to whittle their enemies down. They have 3 DPS specs, starting with their pure range spec, which specialises in bursting down foes from afar with a bow, crossbow or gun. They have decent escapes and snares to maintain their range and keep enemies at bay. Hunters can also specialise in their pet for damage, focusing on maintaining buffs while letting their pet do a lot of the work. There's even an option to have 2 pets if one isn't enough. The spec is considered simple to play with less abilities than the other specs, but still plenty of fun if it appeals to you. Lastly, their newest and most unique spec is a kind of melee ranged DPS role that is as comfortable in melee as it is from afar. Their kit uses coordinated attacks with their pet, as well as the use of explosives, either equipping a polearm or a staff as their weapon of choice. Shamans are the second and only other male-wearing class, masters of the elements and more in tune with the primal chaos of the likes of earth, fire, water and air. Shamans are another hybrid class that have a mixture of damage and healing abilities through the use of elemental shock spells, summoned elemental support and most notably totems. There are a myriad of totems offering utility, individually slowing, healing, stunning and damage dealing depending on the ones you place on the ground. They can also purge enemy magic buffs and also have the ability to transform into a ghost wolf, increasing movement speed and becoming immune to slows. Their healing spec is a mixture of heal over time and direct healing, using earth shields to defend allies and water shields for mana regen. Their melee spec feels like a more caster-focused approach, building up a resource called Maelstrom as you slam enemies with lightning damage and unleash your Maelstrom in the form of spells that become instant cast. They can summon ally ghost wolves to aid them and have decent hybrid healing. Finally, they also have a ranged DPS spec, also a hybrid in that they have castable healing. They have a mixture of damage over time spells that synergize well with affording the opportunity to deal direct damage spells to the enemy with no cast time. They have a very distinctive knockback, perfect for the edges of cliffs, and deal a lot of ranged pressure in general. The first of the lever classes to talk about will be Rogue, masters of the shadows, locking down enemies and even dishing out bursts of melee damage. They use a resource called energy, which is quickly spent and quickly replenished, in order to use combo point generating abilities. These combo points are then spent on finishers whose output potential scales with the number of combo points consumed. They have fantastic crowd control and one of 2 classes that have access to stealth, an ability that renders you undetectable by anyone that isn't standing right on top of you, leaving you with the opportunity to engage fights fully on your own terms. Rogues can spec for deadly poisons and bleed damage using daggers to load up their target with damage over time effects before twisting the knife so that they really come alive. Due to this, their sustained damage on a single target is pretty strong. Another dagger spec will have the rogue utilising the effects of stealth, and the special effects that you can use when attacking from stealth. It's more valuable for its utility and requires good awareness to juggle abilities effectively. Their last spec is a less stealthy variant that comes with a pirate theme. It's less focused on being deceptive through stealth mechanics and a bit more of a bruiser type of playstyle. Good defensives and high uptime on damage, the retractable hook can get you around quickly and efficiently if it's dodging boss mechanics or chasing down stragglers in PvP. Monks are masters of no weapon combat. Although you'll see them carrying weapons most of the time, they choose not to use it. Monks by design are both fluid and fast-paced to play, with fantastic mobility, a short-range teleport, and every one of their specs plays considerably different to their role's counterparts. As a tank, they focus on staggering damage over long periods of time, making it easier for healers to deal with them due to never taking much burst at any single moment. They deal well with physical and magic damage and keep all the interesting utility afforded to the base monk class. The melee DPS spec has you weaving abilities together with a high APM rate compared to most other classes during normal play. Just getting your rotation off will have your fingers feeling like they're personally dishing out the pain themselves. The burst potential of this spec is wild, and with the help of some summon support and blazing fists of fury, anyone in range should watch out. The healing spec has a mixture of heal over time and direct healing, but the monk has to spend more time standing still to heal than most due to being locked into channeling a sort of base healing spell before firing off more heals. However, like much of the rest of the class, when they aren't required to heal in the moment, their mobility is still extremely impressive compared to most classes, allowing them to move around the battlefield with ease. The Druid, I would say, is the jack of all trades, master of some. Capable of performing every role, mostly through the versatility of their shape-shifting animal forms. At their disposal is a travel form that comes in ground, air and underwater variants, cat form for melee damage, bear for defense, and moonkin for range casting DPS. The act of shape-shifting allows the Druid to remove all snares and slows, making them incredibly hard to catch. Due to having these forms, they are the least able to show off cool looking gear when in combat, so bear this in mind if that's important to you. As their tank spec, they utilise bear form, with a loose resemblance to the warrior class, as a bear uses the same rage mechanic and has access to a similar charge ability. It has greatly increased health, powerful health regen abilities, as well as some good area of effect bleeds applied to nearby enemies. They're quite simple to play and just incredibly hard to kill. The first of their two DPS specs focuses on the cat form for damage, most reminiscent of the rogue, as it has access to the stealth mechanic, allowing them to always get the drop on their enemy, and also uses the same energy resource. Their damage often leans towards a dot-heavy bleed playstyle. Cat form has slightly increased movement speed than normal running, so they're great at staying in the fight too, utilising great hybrid healing along the way. The second of their DPS specs is a ranged caster that uses the moonkin form. Not the most popular looking form they have, but the forms have various recolors or reskins that can change the look if need be. This spec has a mixture of instant cast damage over time spells, as well as casted abilities, so can be useful on the move as well as situations where they can stop and hard cast. The final spec is their healing spec, which currently uses the humanoid form for casting, and relies primarily on heal over time effects. The playstyle would see the Druids stacking up heals on allies they feel are about to receive damage, or topping everyone off to deal with random chip damage. The Demon Hunter is the second hero class added to WoW, with unprecedented movement mechanics and fluidity. They have a double jump and are able to glide at any time while in the air. For many, this is a level of freedom that makes going back to any other class feel like something is missing. Demon Hunters transform into a powerful demon through metamorphosis for bouts of high octane output. The tank spec has great damage mitigation and an unbelievable amount of mobility. Great for kiting enemies and stalling damage, they have good self-healing and area of effect spells capable of a bunch of useful utility. The DPS spec has extremely powerful offensive cooldowns, frequent uptime on high mobility, and takes on large packs of mobs in the open world quite easily, due to producing fragments that heal the Demon Hunter when killing enemies. Their damage output is not particularly cooldown oriented, so they can maintain consistent high damage over the course of a fight. Finally, we hit the cloth wearers with the Priest, the holy caster with the ability to pull allies from harm, heal effectively, and dish out some damage when need be. They have a pure healing spec with incredible tools for strong single target healing and a bunch of utility to boot. The next healing spec moves a bit more into the realms of a hybrid due to its use of shields and keeping buffs on allies that heals them based on the damage dealt by the priest. For a healer, the damage output of this spec can be pretty decent. However, it takes a little bit of a learning curve due to how different it is from a traditional healing spec. If healing gets a bit stale or you want to see some health bars go down, you can play as their Dark Shadow DPS spec. Shadow form will give you this unique shadowy aura, with great sustained damage, utilising damage over time spells on enemies. They keep a bunch of the healing capabilities, albeit at a reduced effectiveness to the healing specs, but it allows them to have a strong hybrid DPS playstyle, with plenty of useful utility to boot. Mages are the epitome of the cloth-wearing caster class, With an affinity to certain magic schools, they have unprecedented control of their enemies, great mobility and unique utility. Their most iconic spells probably being Polymorph, turning their foes into sheep, and Blink to get around the battlefield. Outside of combat, mages can teleport freely to major locations across Azeroth and even portal allies if need be. Conjuring Food also makes them very useful to have in the party for the times the team need to recover from a long engagement. Their fire spec is the most aggressive of the lot, using a mixture of casted and instant cast spells to chain critical damage on the enemy. It has high amounts of burst and fantastic single target potential. However, Arcane probably has the highest single target potential, scaling damage up rapidly at the expense of huge mana costs. It's less mobile and therefore takes advantage of being able to stand on the same spot to cast. And their Frost spec is a happy medium of defense and offense. Spells with decent damage, they're also slow enemies too. They have plenty of snares and slows with the ability to control melee quite easily. Warlocks are a ranged damage class that deals fire and shadow damage to their enemies. With the aid of a demonic pet, they have great self-sufficiency through conjuring health stones and healing themselves through damaging enemies. They can cast fear into their enemies, buying them time to survive, or putting their enemies on the back foot. The pet spec revolves around summoning countless demons to their side. Whilst these pets deal damage, they're also used to buff the Warlock's damage a considerable amount, making it a spec that carries a lot of presence on the battlefield. If you prefer the more typical caster playstyle, they also have a cookie cutter spec that focuses on hard casting extremely powerful single target damage, with some of the most bursty damage you'll see in the game. And finally, they have a damage over time spec, which focuses on getting your damage debuffs on every enemy you can find, then unleashing even more pain onto all of them. This spec has great spread pressure and can be carried out while being decently mobile due to all the instant cast abilities. Now that you've had a flavour of the different classes, if some of them stood out to you more than others, I'd encourage you to do a deeper dive elsewhere. The aim of the video was just to scratch the surface for someone who is brand new to the game, and therefore I left out things that would have needed a bit more explanation. There are plenty of useful guides and showcases of the individual classes out there, so I hope we're able to help point you in the right direction. Drop a comment down below about what your favourite class is and why, or if you had any questions, no matter how silly, and we'll see if we can get you an answer.